The static crackled, then cleared, revealing voices. They were crisp, confident, debating flight formations, target acquisition, and evasive maneuvers in perfect, unaccented English. German intercept operators, veterans of countless air battles, logged the chatter, cross-referencing call signs and frequencies. Their equipment confirmed the signals originated from the Allied air fleet currently penetrating Reich airspace. Yet a cold unease settled over the listening post. Their intelligence dossiers, their deeply ingrained understanding of the enemy's operational structure, insisted these pilots, with their distinct communication patterns and assertive tactical discussions, could not exist. This was a direct, inexplicable challenge to their established reality, a phantom threat they could not yet comprehend. Prepare yourself for a story that dissects the brutal mechanics of aerial warfare and unearths a crucial turning point, a narrative of overlooked brilliance that defied the grinding machinery of prejudice and conflict. The year was 1943. Across the vast expanse of the European theater, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was faltering. Fortresses and liberators, B-17s and B-24s, lumbered deep into German territory, their payloads aimed at industrial heartlands. But the cost was catastrophic. Missions over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen became synonymous with slaughter. German Luftwaffe fighters, nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s, tore through bomber formations with devastating efficiency. The skies over Europe were a graveyard, littered with the wreckage of aircraft and the lives of young men. Entire crews, 10 men per bomber, vanished in fireballs. The morale of bomber crews plummeted, threatened by the statistical certainty of death. At the heart of this grim calculation was Sergeant Elias Vance, a junior intelligence analyst attached to a Bomber Command airbase in England. Vance was not a pilot, nor a high-ranking officer. He was a man of meticulous detail, his days consumed by debriefings, damage reports, and casualty figures. His office, a cramped space filled with maps and flight manifests, became a silent testament to the daily attrition. Vance processed the raw data of human loss. He charted the routes, noted the points of interception, and listened to the haunted accounts of returning bomber crews. He saw the patterns: the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, the primary escort fighters, lacked the range to accompany the bombers to their deepest targets. When they did escort, their tactics often prioritized engaging enemy fighters, leaving the bombers vulnerable to a second wave of attacks. The established doctrine was failing. Vance observed the palpable frustration among the bomber crews, a quiet despair that permeated the mess halls and briefing rooms. They spoke of their little friends, the fighter escorts, but often with a bitter undertone. The escorts would disengage prematurely or become embroiled in dogfights far removed from the vulnerable bomber stream. The official remedies appeared inadequate, languid, or altogether absent. High Command rigidly adhered to prevailing tactics, citing operational constraints and resource limitations. Vance discerned the human toll exacted by this inertia. He noted the vacant bunks, the unread correspondence, the families awaiting mournful telegrams. He also perceived another, more insidious yet equally pervasive frustration within the broader command structure: systemic prejudice. Stationed in proximity to his own unit was the 332nd Fighter Group, an exclusively black unit whose pilots had received their training at Tuskegee, Alabama. They flew P-39 Airacobras and P-47s, and subsequently the P-51 Mustang. Vance frequently observed their ground crews and pilots moving with an understated resolve, yet they were invariably assigned to missions of lesser criticality, often relegated to coastal patrols or ground attack sorties, conspicuously absent from the pivotal bomber escort missions where attrition rates were most severe. The prevailing sentiment, though frequently unspoken, was deeply ingrained. Black pilots supposedly lacked the requisite skill, valor, or intellectual acumen for sophisticated aerial combat. This institutional bias incensed Vance. He viewed it not merely as morally reprehensible, but strategically calamitous. An entire, potentially invaluable combat asset was being systematically underleveraged. sidelined by racist presuppositions. Vance's intellect, accustomed to meticulously dissecting operational data, began to forge connections between seemingly disparate observations. He scrutinized the performance metrics of all fighter groups, not exclusively those designated as elite. He noted the 332nd's exemplary maintenance logs, their remarkably low incidence of friendly fire, and their disciplined flight formations during their limited, often less illustrious, engagements. He commenced compiling his own informal dataset, cross-referencing their sortie reports with the aggregate bomber losses. The figures, though constrained, suggested an untapped reservoir of potential, a resource being squandered. He endeavored, initially with circumspection, to articulate his disquietude. During debriefings, he would subtly challenge extant escort strategies, proposing alternative deployment paradigms. His suggestions were met with perfunctory dismissals, occasionally punctuated by a condescendingly familiar clap on the shoulder. "Sergeant Vance, confine yourself to your charts. The generals are fully apprised of the operational imperatives." The implicit message was unambiguous. A junior analyst, and one devoid of direct combat experience, was ill-advised to question established doctrine, particularly when it entailed challenging the prevailing racial hierarchy. The bureaucracy, ossified and self-assured, presented an insurmountable impediment. It privileged conventional wisdom, even when that wisdom was demonstrably faltering. The frustration gnawed at Vance. He witnessed the constant stream of replacements for downed airmen, the fresh faces arriving only to be swallowed by the same unforgiving skies. He knew the official narrative, that the bomber crews would eventually overwhelm German defenses through sheer numbers. But Vance saw the human cost of that numbers game. He saw the individual lives, the shattered hopes. He began to feel an urgent, almost desperate, need to act. The system was failing, and countless lives were being sacrificed to a combination of tactical shortcomings and ingrained prejudice. He started to look for answers beyond the official channels, beyond the established parameters. He began to scrutinize the German intercept reports, those same reports that registered an inexplicable anomaly. He focused on the details, the specific frequencies used by Allied fighters, the tactical language, the call signs. He sought patterns, deviations, anything that might explain the disparity between official reports and the realities of combat. His search was driven by an unwavering principle. If there was a way to reduce the losses, it had to be found, regardless of who found it or who implemented it. The lives of the bomber crews depended on it. Static crackled, then cleared, revealing voices. They were crisp, confident, discussing flight formations, target acquisition, and evasive maneuvers in perfect, unaccented English. German interception operators, veterans of countless aerial battles, logged the conversation, cross-referencing call signs and frequencies. Their equipment confirmed the signals originated from the Allied air fleet penetrating Reich airspace. Yet, a cold disquiet settled over the listening post. Their intelligence dossiers, their deeply ingrained understanding of the enemy's operational structure, insisted these pilots, with their distinct communication patterns and assertive tactical discussions, could not exist. This was a direct, inexplicable challenge to their established reality, a phantom threat they could not yet comprehend. Prepare for a story that dissects the brutal mechanics of air warfare and unearths a pivotal turning point, a narrative of overlooked brilliance that defied the crushing machinery of prejudice and conflict. The year was 1943. Across the vast expanse of the European theater, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was foundering. Fortresses and liberators, B-17s and B-24s, lumbered deep into German territory, their payloads aimed at industrial hearts. But the cost was catastrophic. Missions over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Bremen had become synonymous with carnage. German Luftwaffe fighters, agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf F-190s, tore through bomber formations with devastating efficiency. The skies of Europe were a charnel house, littered with the wreckage of aircraft and the lives of the young. Entire crews, 10 men to a bomber, vanished in fireballs. Bomber crew morale plummeted. threatened by the statistical certainty of death. At the epicenter of this grim calculus stood Sergeant Elias Vance, a junior intelligence analyst attached to a bomber command airbase in England. Vance was no pilot nor a high-ranking officer. He was a man of meticulous detail, his days consumed by briefings, damage reports, and casualty figures. His office, a cramped space bristling with maps and flight manifests, became a silent testament to the daily attrition. Vance processed the raw data of human loss. He traced the routes, noted the interception points, and listened to the haunted accounts of returning bomber crews. He saw the patterns. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, the principal escort fighters, lacked the range to accompany bombers to their deepest targets. When they did escort, their tactics often prioritized engaging enemy fighters, leaving the bombers vulnerable to a second wave of attacks. The established doctrine was failing. Vance observed the frustration amongst the bomber crews, a silent desperation that permeated the mess halls and briefing rooms. They spoke of the little friends, their escort fighters, but often with a bitter tone. The escorts peeled off too soon or engaged in dogfights far from the vulnerable bomber stream. Official solutions seemed inadequate, glacially slow, or non-existent. High command insisted on current tactics, citing operational limitations and resource constraints. Vance saw the human cost of this inertia. He saw the empty bunks, the unread letters, the families back home soon to receive telegrams. He also observed another frustration, more subtle yet equally pervasive within the broader command structure: systemic prejudice. Stationed not far from his own unit was the 332nd Fighter Group, an all-black pilot unit trained in Tuskegee, Alabama. They flew P-39 Airacobras and P-47s, and later, the P-51 Mustang. Vance frequently saw their ground crews, their pilots, moving with a quiet determination, yet they were consistently assigned less critical missions, often relegated to coastal patrols or ground attack roles, far from the crucial bomber escort missions where losses were heaviest. The prevailing sentiment, often unspoken but deeply understood, was that black pilots lacked the requisite skill, courage, or intellectual capacity for complex aerial combat. This institutional bias infuriated Vance. He saw it not merely as morally repugnant, but strategically asinine. An entire, potentially vital combat asset was being systematically underutilized, marginalized by racist assumptions. Vance's mind, accustomed to dissecting operational data, began to connect disparate observations. He studied the performance records of all fighter groups, not just those deemed elite. He noted the 303 meticulous maintenance logs, their low incidence of friendly fire, and their disciplined flight formations during their limited, often less prestigious engagements. He started compiling his own informal data, cross-referencing their sortie reports against overall bomber losses. The numbers, albeit limited, suggested untapped potential, a resource being squandered. He tried discreetly at first to voice his concerns. During briefings, he subtly questioned existing escort strategies, suggesting alternative deployments. His suggestions were met with polite dismissals, sometimes a condescending pat on the shoulder. "Sergeant Vance, stick to your charts. The generals know what they're doing." The implicit message was clear. A junior analyst, and one without combat experience, was not meant to challenge established doctrine, especially when it involved questioning the racial hierarchy. The bureaucracy, rigid and self-assured, was an impenetrable wall. It prioritized conventional wisdom, even when that wisdom was demonstrably failing. Vance felt a gnawing frustration. He was witnessing the endless churn of replacements for shot-down airmen, fresh faces arriving, only to be consumed by the same unforgiving skies. He knew the official narrative, that bomber crews would eventually overwhelm German defenses through sheer numbers. But Vance saw the human cost of this numbers game. He saw the individual lives, the shattered hopes. He began to feel an urgent, almost desperate need to act. The system was failing, and countless lives were being sacrificed to a confluence of tactical deficiencies and entrenched prejudice. He started to seek answers beyond official channels. beyond the established parameters. He began to pore over German intercept reports, those same reports that logged an inexplicable anomaly. He focused on the minutiae, the specific frequencies used by Allied fighters, the tactical language, the call signs. He was searching for patterns, deviations, anything that could explain the disparity between official reports and the realities of combat. His quest was driven by an unshakable principle. If there was a way to reduce losses, it had to be found, regardless of who found it or who implemented it. The lives of bomber crews depended on it. Vance knew the official channels were dead ends. The daily casualty reports, the empty bunks, were a grim, constant reminder. He began his work in the quiet hours after duty, poring over stacks of flight logs, mission briefings, and crucially, the German intercept reports. The phantom threat that vexed the German operators intrigued him. He cross-referenced the communication patterns attributed to this unknown group with the known flight characteristics of the 332nd Fighter Group. He noted their precise, almost formal radio discipline, a stark contrast to the more informal chatter often heard from other units. This discipline, born of rigorous training at Tuskegee and a constant need to prove competence, was a tactical asset. He began to meticulously trace the 332nd's limited combat sorties. Their P-47 Thunderbolts, while potent, were often deployed on lower-impact missions. Vance saw their efficiency, their low attrition rates, their consistent adherence to flight plans. He began to draw correlations between the 332nd's presence, even in a peripheral role, and slight, almost imperceptible reductions in bomber losses in adjacent sectors. The data was sparse, circumstantial, but it pointed to a consistent operational integrity. Vance's innovation was not merely about the deployment of the 332nd. It was about how they would be deployed. The prevailing doctrine for fighter escorts was aggressive pursuit. Engage enemy fighters, shoot down. But this often meant escorts broke formation, leaving bombers exposed. Vance envisioned a different role, a steadfast, unwavering shield. He theorized that if a disciplined, skilled fighter group committed to staying with the bombers, regardless of the temptation of aerial combat, the psychological and tactical advantage would shift. The escort would not be a hunter, but a guardian. He elaborated tactical diagrams, charting hypothetical engagements. His chart showed the P-51 Mustang, then being slowly introduced to various fighter groups, as the ideal aircraft for this role due to its extended range. He knew the 332nd was slated to receive Mustangs. This alignment of superior aircraft with a disciplined unit and a revised tactical doctrine formed the core of his proposal. The P-51, with its range, could escort bombers to targets deep within the Reich, and the 332nd, Vance believed, possessed the discipline to execute the stick-with-us strategy. His initial attempts to present these ideas met predictable resistance. He tried to present his findings to a mid-level operations officer, Major Thompson, during a routine intelligence briefing. Thompson listened, his expression unreadable, then dismissed Vance's charts with a wave of his hand. "Sergeant, your enthusiasm is noted, but we don't re-engineer established doctrines based on anecdotal observations, especially not from unproven units." The unspoken prejudice hung heavy in the air. Vance was told to focus on actual intelligence, not speculative tactical reform. Undeterred, Vance sought out Lieutenant Commander Miller, a gruff but pragmatic veteran of ground operations. Miller had seen too many planes return riddled with holes. Too many crews fail to return. Vance presented his data, focusing on the sheer waste of human and material resources. Miller, who grappled daily with supply requisitions for parts and personnel, understood the cost. He did not endorse Vance's radical ideas, but he did not dismiss them outright either. He simply grunted, "Data is data, Vance, but getting someone to act on it is another fight." Vance realized he needed more than data. He needed a demonstration. He began to unobtrusively observe the 332nd's operations on base. He spoke with his ground crew chiefs, subtly inquiring about their maintenance protocols, their pilot training, their morale. He found a unit that was not merely competent, but exceptionally dedicated, driven by a dual purpose: to win the war and to challenge the pervasive racism that questioned their very right to fight. Their discipline was not simply military, it was a matter of profound personal and racial pride. He also cultivated a quiet, almost imperceptible connection with some of the 332nd's pilots, particularly Captain Benjamin Carter, a thoughtful and highly skilled aviator. Vance never fully revealed his complete plan directly, but he subtly probed Carter's views on escort tactics, on the efficacy of current strategies. Carter, like Vance, voiced frustration with the high bomber losses and the perceived inadequacy of current escort methods. He spoke of a desire to truly protect the bombers, not merely engage in aerial dogfights. This confirmed Vance's hypothesis. The 332nd pilot shared his overarching objective. The opportunity, when it arose, was unsanctioned. It began as a series of subtle adjustments to routes and communication protocols, facilitated by Miller, who, without fully comprehending Vance's intent, agreed to optimize some less critical escort assignments. Vance had identified a period when the 332nd, now equipped with P-51 Mustangs, was tasked with escorting a relatively smaller group of B-17s on a medium-range mission to a secondary target. He prepared a concise, unofficial briefing for Captain Carter, focusing on the critical importance of maintaining a tight formation with the bombers, regardless of enemy fighter presence. "Your primary mission," Vance emphasized, "is the bomber. Stay with them, protect them. Do not break formation for anything less than a direct attack on your charge." The mission was designated Operation Safeguard, a name Vance had unofficially assigned in his internal notes. The weather was clear, favorable to both bombers and interceptors. German intelligence, having tracked the bomber formation, anticipated a standard, aggressive fighter escort that would soon break away or engage in extended dogfights. They prepared their interceptors accordingly. As bombers advanced into enemy territory, Luftwaffe fighters ascended to meet them. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swarmed, their guns spitting fire. But this time something was different. The 332nd's P-51s, rather than fanning out to chase individual targets, clung to the bomber formation. They weaved through attacking German fighters, engaging only when directly threatened, always returning to their protective positions. Their radio chatter, crisp and coordinated, spoke of defensive maneuvers, of maintaining integrity, of staying with the big friends. Back at the listening posts, German intercept operators were bewildered. The aggressive flanking maneuvers expected of Allied escorts were absent. Instead, a disciplined wall of Mustangs shielded the fortresses. The voices on the radio, those same confident, unaccented English voices, were issuing precise defensive instructions, maintaining an impenetrable screen. Their reports once again logged an anomaly. "The escorts," one report noted, "are not aggressively engaging. They are staying with the bombers." A new tactic? Confusion was palpable. Vance, listening to the post-mission debriefs, felt a flicker of hope. Bomber losses for Operation Safeguard were significantly lower than projected, almost negligible. Returning bomber crews spoke of angels who never left them, of escorts who seemed to prioritize their survival above all else. They didn't know who these pilots were, only that they were different. Vance knew. He had seen the data, he had heard the German bewilderment. The seeds of his innovation, nurtured in secrecy and implemented against all odds, were showing their first fragile sprouts of success. But this was just a single, unsanctioned mission. Bureaucracy, prejudice, remained. The real fight to institutionalize this life-saving tactic had only just begun. The stakes were still immense, the path ahead fraught with opposition. Operation Safeguard's success, though undeniable in its immediate results, remained an anomaly in official records. Sergeant Vance meticulously compiled the post-mission interrogations, comparing the minimal losses of that single sortie against the mounting attrition rates of other bomber raids. The numbers were stark. On missions where the 332nd Fighter Group had flown their disciplined, stay with the bomber's escort pattern, the ratio of lost bombers to enemy fighters plummeted, sometimes to zero. On conventional missions, the numbers continued their grim ascent. Vance saw irrefutable evidence. The command structure saw a statistical spike, easily dismissed as an outlier, favorable winds, or sheer luck. He attempted to present his updated findings. Detailed charts were prepared, illustrating the inverse correlation between the 303 seconds escort method and bomber vulnerability. He highlighted the specific radio chatter intercepted by the Germans, noting their bewilderment at the new tactics. This time, he bypassed Major Thompson, seeking an audience with a more senior operations officer, Colonel Davies, known for his rigid adherence to protocol. Davies listened, his gaze fixed on Vance's meticulously prepared documents, yet his response was immediate and dismissive. "Sergeant Vance, your enthusiasm is commendable. However, we do not base strategic changes on isolated missions, especially those initiated outside established command channels. Furthermore," Davies paused, his voice lowering slightly, "the deployment of certain units in critical, high-attrition roles requires careful consideration of moral implications and performance capabilities. We have doctrines established for a reason." The unspoken words hung in the air. Prejudice was an immovable fixation. Vance understood. His data wasn't just challenging tactics, it was challenging deeply ingrained racial assumptions. The rejection was a cold confirmation of the wall he faced. Lives were being lost daily, and the solution to Vance was right before them, yet actively ignored. Frustration intensified, now mingled with a sense of urgency bordering on desperation. He saw the new replacement pilots arriving from the States, eager and young, only to be fed into the meat grinder of the European skies. He knew their fate if nothing changed. Vance realized he needed an advocate, someone within the system who possessed influence and the willingness to look beyond established biases. He turned his attention to the 332nd Fighter Group itself. Their quiet determination, their unyielding discipline, their consistent performance despite being marginalized, had impressed him. He arranged an unofficial meeting with Captain Carter, ostensibly to discuss improved intelligence exchange. Carter arrived, a man whose calm masked an intense focus. Vance laid out his full analysis, detailing the stick with the bombers strategy, the statistical impact of Operation Safeguard, and the dismissive response from command. Carter listened intently, his expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. "We've always believed in protecting our bombers, Sergeant. It's why we're here. We just needed the chance." Carter confirmed that the 302nd pilots were eager for more challenging escort missions. They had grown frustrated with their peripheral assignments, knowing they could contribute more but being denied the opportunity. Their P-51 Mustangs, now fully operational, offered the range and speed necessary for deep penetration missions. The pilots had already, instinctively, developed a stay-with-the-formation ethos. Understanding their primary role was protection, not individual glory and dogfights. Vance's data merely quantified what they already knew intuitively. This shared understanding, forged in the crucible of various forms of prejudice, had become a silent, powerful alliance. The challenge remained: how to get the 382nd officially and consistently assigned to the critical role of deep penetration escort. Vance knew another unsanctioned mission would invite severe repercussions, potentially jeopardizing the entire unit and his own career. He needed a way to leverage the existing system, to find a fissure in its rigid structure. He began to subtly influence the flow of information. During intelligence briefings, he emphasized the P-51's range capabilities and the superior maintenance records of certain fighter groups, implicitly highlighting the 392nd without naming them directly. He would accidentally leave his detailed charts showing the efficacy of the stick-with-the-bombers strategy on tables where they might be discovered by junior officers. He was planting seeds, hoping some would take root. Meanwhile, the war continued its brutal course. The early part of 1944 saw the Allied air offensive intensify. Missions over Berlin, Leipzig and Frankfurt became synonymous with carnage. German air defenses, though strained, remained formidable. The Luftwaffe, still operating from well-defended airfields, inflicted heavy casualties. The strategic bombing campaign, despite its immense scale, was still a war of attrition, one the Allies were winning, but at a horrific human cost. The 8th Air Force, the primary strategic bombing force, was bleeding. Vance observed a growing desperation in elements of the high command. The sheer volume of losses was becoming unsustainable, both in aircraft and trained personnel. The public back home, fed optimistic reports, was unaware of the true scale of the slaughter. But the men in the field and the few officers willing to confront the grim reality knew. This desperation, Vance gambled, might finally create an opening. A critical opportunity arose during the planning of Operation Argument, later known as Big Week, in February 1944. This was to be a sustained, coordinated assault on Germany's aircraft production facilities, a knockout blow to the Luftwaffe. The missions would be deep, dangerous, and demand every available fighter escort. The stakes were unprecedented. Command was under immense pressure to reduce bomber losses. Failure could cripple the entire strategic bombing effort. In the frenzied planning sessions leading up to Big Week, the issue of fighter escort became paramount. Every available P-51 group was being allocated. Vance, working late into the night, prepared a comprehensive anonymous report comparing the performance of various fighter groups on deep penetration missions, subtly weaving in the data from the unnamed Operation Safeguard. He focused on the outcomes, bomber loss rates, enemy fighter kills, and crucially, the return-to-base rates for the escort fighters themselves. The data consistently pointed to one group, simply labeled Unit X, as having the lowest bomber loss rates and the highest escort integrity. This report landed on the desk of General Carl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe. Spaatz, a pragmatic, results-oriented leader, was known to sometimes bypass conventional wisdom when lives were on the line. He saw the numbers, the stark contrast between Unit X and others. He demanded to know the identity of Unit X. The revelation that Unit X was the 332nd Fighter Group, the unit composed exclusively of black pilots, was met with predictable resistance from his staff. Arguments of morale, integration issues, and unproven capabilities resurfaced. But Spaatz, facing the unprecedented losses and immense pressure of Big Week, made a decision. He ordered the 332nd Fighter Group to be assigned to deep penetration escort missions during Operation Argument, specifically tasking them with protecting the vulnerable bomber formations to and from their targets. It was a calculated risk, a desperate measure driven by necessity, not enlightened policy. Vance received the news via the Operational Intelligence Network. A quiet satisfaction settled over him, mingled with a profound sense of responsibility. His innovation, born of frustration and meticulous observation, was finally getting a large-scale chance. The 332nd would fly, not on a single unsanctioned sortie, but as a critical component of the largest aerial offensive in history. The institutional wall had cracked, not shattered, but enough for a pivotal shift. The true test of the stick with the bombers strategy and the courage and skill of the Tuskegee Airmen was now imminent. The skies over Germany were about to witness a silent revolution in aerial warfare. February 1944, the airfields across England buzzed with a controlled frenzy. Mechanics swarmed over B-17s and B-24s, fueling, arming, and patching. P-51 Mustangs, sleek and deadly, received their final checks. The air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel, oil, and the unspoken tension that preceded Operation Argument, the Big Week. Sergeant Elias Vance moved through the preparations, a ghost in the machine, observing, absorbing. His role was still officially that of an intelligence analyst, processing incoming data, not orchestrating tactical deployments. Yet he knew the assignment of the 332nd Fighter Group was a direct result of his quiet persistence, his meticulously compiled, anonymously presented data. He watched the Tuskegee Airmen, their faces grim but resolute, as they received their final briefings. Their P-51s, now painted with distinctive red tails, stood ready. This was not a single, unsanctioned mission. This was a sustained, brutal air offensive, and the lives of thousands of bomber crewmen rested on their performance. The first wave of bombers lifted into the pre-dawn gloom on February 20, 1944, their engines a thunderous roar. Target: aircraft factories in Leipzig. The 332nd, flying as the high escort, took their positions. Captain Benjamin Carter, leading his squadron, communicated with a calm precision that belied the immense pressure. "Maintain integrity. Stick to the big friends. No chasing." These were Vance's words, refined and adopted by the pilots. As they crossed the enemy coast, German radar picked them up. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled their fighters, Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader, 27 FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader 1. The air became a lethal chessboard. German intercept operators, straining to decipher the static, registered the unmistakable roar of P-51 engines. Then the voices, crisp, confident, unaccented English. Yet, the tactical vernacular diverged. "Hold formation. Cover the lead element. Don't break off." A conspicuous absence of the aggressive, individualistic chatter endemic to numerous Allied fighter groups. German air commanders, accustomed to escorts peeling away to engage in dogfights, anticipated the customary pandemonium. They expected the bombers to be left exposed subsequent to the initial engagements. But these red-tailed Mustangs maintained their positions with an unnerving adherence to discipline. They engaged solely when German fighters directly imperiled the bomber stream, then immediately reverted to their protective cordon. Back in England, Vance monitored the real-time reports filtering into the operations room. Initial contacts, engagements. The inaugural dispatches of bomber losses began to trickle in from disparate formations. Subsequently, a peculiar pattern materialized for the formations escorted by the 332nd. Their attrition rates were remarkably attenuated. Not negligible, for no mission was devoid of cost, but significantly sub-average, almost defying the established probabilities of a deep penetration mission over heavily fortified German territory. Vance cross-referenced the flight paths, the reported enemy concentrations, the meteorological conditions. The data was corroborative. The "stick with the bombers" stratagem was proving efficacious. The internal resistance within the Allied command, however, persisted. Colonel Davies, still dubious, dismissed the nascent reports. Statistical aberration, propitious weather perhaps, or attenuated enemy opposition within their sector. He attributed the success to any factor other than the capabilities of the 332nd or the efficacy of Vance's unconventional strategy. "We cannot extrapolate conclusions from a singular day's operation, Sergeant. The big week has merely commenced." The bureaucracy, ossified and self-assured, was tardy in relinquishing its ingrained preconceptions, even in the face of accumulating evidence. The missions continued, each day more grueling than the last, from February 20th to the 25th. Schweinfurt, Brunswick, Oschersleben, Gotha. Each objective represented a gauntlet of flak and fighter assaults. The 332nd flew daily, frequently undertaking the longest, most perilous legs of the journey. Their P-51s, endowed with their extended operational range, were ideally suited for the deep penetration role. Their discipline, however, constituted their most formidable asset. They remained steadfast with the bombers, absorbing enemy assaults, disrupting German formations, and forestalling the devastating follow-on waves that had previously decimated bomber formations. German intelligence, meanwhile, grew increasingly bewildered. Their intercept reports consistently highlighted the same anomaly: the red tails. Their pilots reported a new, frustratingly effective escort tactic. "They do not chase," one Luftwaffe pilot reported in his debriefing. "They stay with the bombers, a wall of Mustangs. It is impossible to break through to the bombers without engaging them directly, and they are tenacious." The German command, scrambling to understand this shift, began to issue new directives to their fighter groups. focus on breaking the red tail formations, not just the bombers. But the 332nd held. Vance meticulously documented every mission. He tracked the number of bombers lost, the number of successful intercepts, the debriefings of returning bomber crews. The bomber pilots, initially cautious, began to speak of their little friends with a new reverence. They noticed the red tails. They noticed these escorts never left them. Those boys, one B-17 pilot recounted, they were glued to us. Never saw a Messerschmitt get close. The quiet despair that had permeated the bomber crews began to lift, replaced by a fragile but real hope. The impact was not just statistical, it was psychological. German fighter pilots, once confident in their ability to break up bomber formations after initial escort engagements, found themselves facing an unyielding shield. The continuous presence of the P-51s forced them to expend more fuel and ammunition, often aborting attacks when they realized the bombers would not be left undefended. The attrition rate for Luftwaffe pilots began to climb. Despite the undeniable results, the official recognition of the 302nd's unique effectiveness remained subdued. High command reports focused on the overall success of Big Week in crippling German aircraft production, a victory bought at a steep price. The specific contribution of the red-tailed P-51s was often buried in footnotes or generic praise for all fighter units. Vance understood. The entrenched racial prejudices were not easily dislodged, even by overwhelming evidence, but for him, the numbers spoke volumes. The lives saved were the true measure. The Big Week concluded. The strategic bombing campaign had turned a corner. German fighter production had been dealt a severe blow, and the Luftwaffe, though still dangerous, was on the defensive. But the fight for full acknowledgement, for the institutionalization of a strategy born of necessity and executed by those often denied the chance, was far from over. Vance knew the next challenge would be to ensure that the red tails continued to fly deep penetration escorts, not as an emergency measure, but as the established doctrine. The silent revolution had begun, but its full impact on the war and on the history of aviation was still unfolding. Following Operation Argument, Sergeant Vance continued his meticulous analysis. The raw data from the Big Week was undeniable. Formations escorted by the 392nd Fighter Group consistently reported significantly lower bomber losses to enemy fighters. This was not an anomaly, it was a pattern. Vance compiled detailed reports, cross-referencing every mission, every engagement, every loss. His charts now displayed a stark contrast, a clear quantifiable advantage for bomber formations under the protection of the red-tailed P-51s. He focused on statistical integrity, removing any subjective interpretation. The numbers spoke for themselves, a silent yet compelling argument against the prevailing skepticism. He submitted these reports through official channels, this time with a more strategic approach. Instead of directly advocating for the 332nd, he emphasized the efficacy of the tactic. He highlighted the critical importance of committed, close formation escort, demonstrating how it disrupted Luftwaffe attack patterns and preserved bomber integrity. He implicitly linked this to the groups that had achieved these results, allowing the data to guide the conclusion without explicitly naming the Tuskegee Airmen in every sentence. He knew that a direct confrontation with ingrained prejudice would only harden resistance. The facts had to speak for themselves, presented in a manner that offered a solution to a critical problem rather than challenging a social norm. The air war, meanwhile, escalated. March 1944 saw Allied air forces pushing deeper into Germany. The stakes remained critically high. General Jimmy Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, was acutely aware of the ongoing bomber losses despite the successes of Big Week. He was a pragmatic leader, focused on results and the preservation of his crews. Vance's reports, moving up the chain of command, began to gain traction in operations planning. The raw numbers, stripped of racial context, were compelling. As Doolittle's staff presented the aggregated data on escort efficacy, the consistent performance of the 392nd, though still referred to by some as that colored outfit, could no longer be disregarded. On March 24, 1944, a crucial mission to Berlin was planned. This was one of the Reich's deepest, most perilous targets, a mission synonymous with fierce resistance. General Doolittle, faced with the data and a desperate need to minimize losses, made a decisive call. The 332nd Fighter Group, with their red-tailed P-51 Mustangs, was assigned to escort the lead boxes of B-17s to Berlin and back. This was no longer an unsanctioned experiment or a desperate, last-minute allocation. It was a deliberate, high-stakes deployment predicated on demonstrated performance. The stick-with-the-bombers strategy, honed and proven by the Tuskegee Airmen, was now official doctrine for this critical mission. Captain Benjamin Carter and his pilots received the orders with a quiet resolve. They knew the significance. This was the opportunity to solidify their reputation, not just for themselves, but for every black aviator who would follow. Their radio communication during the mission was a testament to their discipline. Keep eyes on the fortress. Keep the screen tight. No straying, gentlemen. German intercept operators, veterans of Big Week, recognized the distinct patterns. They reported that the red tails were back and they were clinging to the bombers with renewed tenacity. Luftwaffe pilots, now alerted, focused their attacks on these unyielding escorts, attempting to break their formations, but the 332nd held firm. Vance spent that day glued to the operations room, monitoring the mission's progress. Reports of anti-aircraft fire, engagements with enemy fighters, and damaged bombers filtered in. The tension was palpable. The hours crawled by. As the first formations began to return, maneuvering back across the North Sea, Vance held his breath. Then the post-mission briefings commenced. Bomber crews, exhausted yet euphoric, spoke of the red-tailed P-51s that had never deserted them. They had witnessed ferocious engagements, but their escorts had formed an impenetrable wall, repelling every assault. The final tally was astounding. On the critical March 24, 1944, Berlin mission bomber formations escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group lost not a single bomber to enemy fighters. This was an almost unprecedented feat throughout the strategic bombing campaign. Word spread like wildfire across the airfields. The Red Tails had achieved the impossible. The statistical anomaly was now an undeniable truth. This single mission became the irrefutable climax, the definitive proof of the innovation's success. It was a testament to Vance's persistent analysis and the unwavering skill and courage of the Tuskegee Airmen. General Doolittle, known for his bluntness, issued a directive. The stay-with-the-bombers strategy, prioritizing the unyielding protection of the bomber stream over individual aerial duels, became standard operating procedure for all 8th Air Force fighter escort groups. The 332nd Fighter Group was then consistently assigned to the most critical deep penetration escort missions, a complete reversal of their initial marginalization. The impact was transformative. Bomber losses began to plummet across the board as other fighter groups adopted the disciplined escort tactics. Bomber crew morale soared. They knew their little friends, especially those with the distinctive red tails, would stick with them. German fighter pilots, once confident in their ability to decimate bomber formations, now faced a formidable and unyielding defense. Their frustration was evident in intercepted communications, their tactics forced to adapt to this new, more effective Allied escort. The silent revolution had become a fundamental shift in aerial warfare. Sergeant Elias Vance observed these developments from his quiet corner. He witnessed the improved morale, the reduced casualty figures, the newfound confidence in the eyes of returning bomber crews. He read the official reports, noting the subtle yet undeniable shift in language, the acknowledgement of effective escort strategies, even if the specific, racially charged origins of that efficacy were still often overlooked. He knew the true impact of his work. He had sought no glory, no promotion, no public recognition. His motivation had been simple: to save lives, to find a solution where the system had failed, and to challenge a prejudice that was costing the Allied war effort dearly. His justice was poetic and profound. The Tuskegee Airmen, through their exceptional skill and unwavering discipline, had carved their place in history, shattering racial barriers in the process. They were no longer that Negro unit. They were the Red Tails, legendary for their protective prowess. Their record, particularly the staggering fact of never losing a single bomber to enemy fighters over 200 escort missions, became a beacon of courage and competence. Vance, the unassuming analyst, remained in the background, his name largely unknown outside of a few operational files. But the thousands of bomber crews who returned home, the families spared a telegram, were the silent beneficiaries of his ingenuity and persistence. His quiet courage in challenging an entrenched system and championing a neglected truth had profoundly altered the course of aerial warfare. His story and theirs became an enduring testament to the power of observation, data, and unyielding principle in the face of overwhelming odds and pervasive prejudice. A victory not just in the skies, but for the very idea of human potential, finally unleashed.